Thank you, Madam President. Last week, during the monthly briefing on the humanitarian situation in Syria, I briefed on the recent developments in Idlib, our current response and the planning underway, and also the preparations should the situation escalate further. Today, I will provide additional update on the situation and the humanitarian response. As the Special Envoy has said, 2.9 million people, almost 3 million, living in Idlib, a de-escalation zone, which includes parts of Idlib, Aleppo, Lattakia and Hama governorates. Of these people, 2.1 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. This includes 1.4 million people who are internally displaced. While our humanitarian response currently focuses on supporting 2.1 million people in need, we are concerned for the protection and safety of all civilians living in the area should the hostilities intensify. On the 4th of September, renewed air and ground-based strikes in western and southern rural Idlib, as well as in northern rural Hama, led to civilian casualties and displacement. Heavy bombardment of the Sugar area of western rural Idlib led to some 13 civilian deaths, including at least 4 children, injuring another 20 civilians. On the 6th of September, a hospital near Kafir Zita in northern Hama was reportedly hit by an airstrike, despite the fact that it had been deconflicted. We also continue to receive reports of improvised explosive devices and other attacks killing and maiming civilians in populated areas throughout Idlib, including humanitarian aid workers. At least 3 doctors have been killed in August alone. As a result of the insecurity, schools in western Idlib and around Sugar and surrounding communities have been suspended. Key crossing points between government and opposition-controlled areas are also reportedly closed, some by the destruction of bridges by non-state armed opposition groups. In addition to restricting freedom of movement for the population, this has also contributed to rising food prices and shortages. Madam President, at the request of humanitarian organisations, the United Nations has provided deconfliction information for 125 humanitarian sites in Idlib to the military actors. This information was submitted to facilitate the parties to identify humanitarian facilities, warehouses, offices and sites where humanitarian assistance is being provided to people in need. In their military operations, all parties bear the obligation to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects, including humanitarian workers and humanitarian facilities. Any deconflicted sites that are reported to have been targeted must be immediately investigated. Madam President, the United Nations and non-governmental organisations continue to implement a major humanitarian operation throughout Idlib, with an average of 2 million people reached every month with cross-border assistance from Turkey. Beyond the provision of assistance, efforts are underway and ongoing to ensure that the people in need can be supported in the event of increased hostilities. Our teams in Damascus and Gaziantep have together developed a readiness plan that sets out a coordinated, flexible response for affected population in the coming period. Plans are in place to support up to 900,000 women, children and men that could be affected by conflict, including up to a potential 700,000 people who may be displaced within Idlib and beyond due to potential hostilities. We also estimate that a potential 100,000 people may cross into government-controlled areas. In addition, if conflict spreads to the Tal Arafat area, we estimate another 100,000 may seek to move towards other areas in Aleppo governorate or to the northeast Syria. Madam President, humanitarian aid is already being positioned inside Idlib as well as in surrounding areas in Aleppo, Lattakia and Hama. This includes ready-to-eat food rations sufficient for 1 week to cover as many as 850,000 people, both through cross-border operations via Turkey and from inside Syria. Additionally, non-food items, shelter, wash and medical supplies are also being pre-positioned. The World Health Organization has dispatched more than 25 tons of supplies to Aleppo over the past month alone. The United Nations has released 20 million from the Turkey Humanitarian Fund Some 10 million of this allocation is focused on ensuring shelter and non-food items will be available should an increase in violence force people to be displaced. While some donors, including the UK and Germany, have recently provided additional resources for which we are most grateful, the amount received falls woefully short of the 311 million that we estimate is required if there is an increase of the violence resulting in large-scale displacement. Simply put, this is funding that we do not currently have, as multiple crises over the last period in Ghouta, Afrin in southern Syria and in Idlib earlier this year have drained our already limited pool of resources. Madam President, civilians in the de-escalation zone have borne the impact of fighting throughout the years of the Syria conflict. These are vulnerable populations who have been displaced to the area from eastern Aleppo, from eastern Ghouta, from northern rural Homs and from southern Syria. Communities and humanitarian responders have been stretched to their limits to support those who arrive often with nothing. The humanitarian impact on civilians of any increase in fighting will therefore be most severe. And the worst-case scenario in Idlib, where millions would flee, will overwhelm all capacity to respond, regardless of plans or funding made available. It has the potential to create a humanitarian emergency at a scale not yet seen through this crisis. In conclusion, Madam President, let me highlight 5 key asks to this Council and through you to all parties to the conflict and those who have influence over them. Number 1, cease hostilities in the area and at minimum ensure there is no escalation. Number 2, ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, including humanitarian and medical personnel and assets, in compliance with the parties' obligations under international humanitarian law. Number 3, respect and enable freedom of movement for people who wish to move in any direction. Additionally, civilians who choose to stay must be allowed to do so and must remain protected. Number 4, allow and facilitate safe, rapid, unhindered and sustained humanitarian access to the people in need through the most direct routes, including to areas which have changed control. And number 5, increase funding for priority response and readiness activities, noting that the humanitarian response is already overstretched. Thank you, Madam President.